Hey guys, Saeed here, Psychology of Spirituality. Last week I touched on some honorable mentions, my 11th film borrowing from Spinal Tap, and then my number 10 to number 6 favorite films of 2022. Films that deal either directly or allude to some psychological, spiritual material, just to help narrow the focus. There's so many other great films that came out this year. I saw Violent Night the other day with David Harbour. That's a really great popcorn entertainment film, but these films go a little bit deeper into the subterfuge, the inner existential aspects of humanity. Also a link to my website in the description below. With that, let's start with number 5, Apollo 10.5 by Richard Linklater.
Houston, this is Apollo 10 now.
The Texas-bred Richard Linklater, whose Before trilogy is ranked as amongst the greatest trilogies of all time, along with other notable works such as Dazed and Confused, To Waking Life, to School of Rock as the film that which introduced me to Led Zeppelin and the Ramones, shout out to School of Rock, and Boyhood, which took him 13-15 years to create, and the underrated Bernie, also with Jack Black, shout out to Jack Black. In general, this film, Apollo 10.5, looks like, when you watch the trailer, it's all about space and astronauts from the onset, but honestly, that's only about 15 to 20% of the film. The rest follows the life of this boy, which is a stand-in for Linklater himself, and the culture of the 60s going into the 70s, and the development of middle America through suburban expansion, the TV, rock music, sports, and the space race, which was a macrocosm for American ingenuity and forwardness. Richard grew up in El Lago, South Houston, which is a few miles from the NASA Johnson Space Center, during the height of the space race, and his father also worked at the Space Center. He imagines himself as this boy being recruited as an astronaut, as I'm sure most young children who grew up during the Apollo missions must have imagined, fantasized about. Besides the astronaut sci-fi, not really sci-fi, but space race related material, this film really, for me, deals with the topic of idealism and nostalgia and boyhood, right? Being young and having this idea of the future being this, ever expanding horizon. There's this great book right here, which I'm linking also below, called Bowling Alone, which documents the decline of communal living and the rise of individualism just in the previous decades, and that being the catalyst for many present psychological issues that we see in today's society, including loneliness, right? And I'm linking here this graphic on the detriment of loneliness and how it's such a major issue in today's society, right? It's interesting because the film really depicts that even something like watching TV used to be a family event. It used to be a communal event because most households only had one TV, whereas today it's just this algorithm driven content machine, individualized to our own temperament, our own interests, right? There's a reason we're all nostalgic, whether it's the 60s or even my generation with the 90s, right? It feels like a more sane time because of our innocence and idealism. A really great film. As someone who now lives in Houston for the past 10 years, 50% of the film is just talking about these Houston landmarks and how the Astrodome and how this city pretty much grew from this just small city area to being the fourth, maybe even the third most populous city in the United States of America. So shout out to Apollo 10.5 and all of Richard Linklater's great work. With that, let's move to number 5, The Batman.
What's black and blue and dead all over you?
So you can take a lot of what I said about my 6th film, The Stranger, and apply it here, following from the criminal thriller psychology genre with Seven, Taxi Driver, Manhunter, and even the graphic novel inspired Long Halloween and Year One as influences for this film right here. This is the This film, The Batman, is the shadow side of the oversaturated, Disney-laden superhero genre, which gives fans a deeper existential and psychological exploration of what drives someone to become a vigilante amidst social unrest and upheaval. And then on the flip side, the character of the Riddler, this madman played greatly by Paul Dano. Matt Reeves, who directed the Planet of the Apes films, the last two at least, had some big shoes to fill after Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, and even Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, which had similar existential markings and a more gritty environmental backdrop. What more is there to say about this character in this world, Batman? From the cartoon shows to video games, shout out to the video games, I think this film is culturally very important because it provides an artistic rebuttal to many who are skeptical and fatigued with the superhero genre, including Alan Moore, Quentin Tarantino, and Martin Scorsese. It says that there are multiple levels of exploration, different voices and temperaments and styles which can be infused to create an alternative superhero film that is accepted by mainstream audiences. An almost 3-hour noir-inspired psychological thriller interpretation of Bruce Wayne finding his footing as the Caped Crusader. Most of my friends agreed after we saw this that this experience felt the closest to reading a graphic novel in cinema. And also a shout out to Peacemaker by James Gunn with John Cena on HBO. DC has been going through a lot of turmoil this past year, but I think there are silver linings. It's not all dark and gloom for DC. With that, let's move to number 4. I guess this would be 4.5. The Iranian film A Hero.
من یه کار نکرده باشی آبرو خود تو خانواده رو ببری دیگه نتونی توی شهر سر بلند کنی.
چی کار کردی؟ چرا کار کردی؟ چی کار کردی؟
I included a separation on my top 10 films of the decade here, and Asghar Farhadi has continued delving into the complexities of being a human with 2016's The Salesman and this year's A Hero, which depicts a man imprisoned for failing to pay his loans. His love interest finds a purse with gold coins, and instead of using that money to free himself by paying back his financier, he returns the purse and is celebrated as a hero. Or so it seems. In most other films, that is enough for a plot, but Asghar Farhadi turns the plot inside out by exploring the innate complexities of this event and those it affects, the people who doubt the reality of Rahim as a hero, the media who jumps onto it for the sensational coverage, the local charities and their endorsements of Rahim, the family who suffers as witnesses, the merging of little white lies with the truth, the good and bad we each enact in our own lives to try and make things a little bit easier for ourselves and our loved ones. What if our lives were put under the microscope? What would be found? Would we still be the good guys or heroes we perceive ourselves to be? I think especially this year with large-scale turmoil in Iran, Iran, which has a very sacred, deep legacy for Shia Muslims, as it's the only Shia theocracy in the world. The direct power of cinema is in its humanization. Also shout out to the film No Bears, made by the imprisoned director Jafar Panahi, and the Jordanian-Palestinian film Farha about the 1948 Nakba, or the exodus of the indigenous Palestinian population. I spoke about accurate representation and its importance in this video right here, where I cited evidence-based research on how exposing different people groups to authentic cinema, just that exposure to that stimulus, was enough to lead to more humanitarian attitudes, right? So this is the direct power of cinema. Shout out to all the great Iranian cinema. I've included a bunch of other films in the videos that I've used on this channel, and I'm linking other ones in the description below. With that, let's move to my number 3 pick, The Banshees of Inisherin.
Can't be waiting around for any more of this madness.
Let's just call it quits.
We won't call it quits. We'll call it the start.
We have a saying from one of our imams, or one of our holy saints, that goes, "A friend cannot be considered a friend until he is tested on 3 occasions: in time of need, behind his friend's back, and after his friend's death." Martin McDonagh's exploration of self-preservation, friendship, and creative expression amidst the Irish Civil War was very provoking for me. I touched on solitude and loneliness in these videos right here, citing research that those who show the greatest mental health benefits from time spent alone, what we would call solitude, are those who already have deep social bonds, not those who are neglecting those social needs to become recluses or hermits, right? So that's reformatting it from solitude to loneliness. Check out those videos if you want to learn more. I love Colin Farrell also. He is one of my favorite actors, and also a shout out to his performance in the underrated After Yang, which also came out this year and explores similar themes of loneliness and acceptance from a more futuristic artificial intelligence lens. Banshees of Inisherin, just like all of McDonagh's previous work, is so finely written with the right balance of satire and darkness. It feels good watching a movie that is flawlessly executed. The beautiful production, acting, and commitment to its themes. How much time and energy do we give to other people versus ourselves? Right? That's, for me, is the main theme of the film. And I'm telling you, as a practicing psychologist, this is amongst the top 5 themes which emerge, especially when you work with young people and families, dysfunctional families. And there's always a level of healthy socialization and structure you need to embed as part of building a comprehensive treatment, but it's never a perfect answer, as Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson find in this movie, right? The limits of a toxic or a healthy friendship or relationship, right? How can we produce that when we are so fallible and our communication is so rudimentary, right? Banshees of Inisherin. With that, let's move to my number 2 pick, the Northmen.
You feel it.
Robert Eggers' brutal depiction of Viking mythology is what we wanted from the figure of Thor and his transcendence as the god of Valhalla and the sacredness of the lore and story, which was completely missed in this year's Thor: Love and Thunder. For me, that film was one of the worst movies of the year because it completely cheapened the deep spiritual and cathartic and religious elements of its own premise. Like, it didn't want to take itself seriously, so why should the audience take it seriously? Which is very unfortunate because it's a Norse mythology. For those of you who've played God of War 1, God of War Ragnarok, you could sense how deep and sacred it is, right? The Northmen, just like Robert Eggers' previous films, The Witch and The Lighthouse, is deeply committed to its own world and character arcs and the realm it creates. It transports you there without cheap callbacks. As someone who believes in sacred rituals and ideologies which beckon for a transcendent divination of the human experience, as I highlighted in my Muslims in the Media series on my website, representation doesn't mean just cultural level aspects of diversity, or even some parts of the Northmen. Depict faith and spirituality in the realm of the sacred as a multi-tiered, dynamic force for ignorance and for upliftment. Watching these films elevates my own understanding of Islam and faith itself as both a force for good and for evil. Let me give a counterexample. A show like Miss Marvel, which came out this year, which I really liked. It was about a second-generation Pakistani Muslim who grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in New York, but those things fit my own identity, at least at a surface level. I'm conscious that this show was made for teenagers and has Islam and Muslims, but it's very surface level. It deals with the realm of the material, whereas faith by its very nature is metaphysical. There's this scene in The Northmen where Skarsgård does this wolf dance with other grown men, and the total sum of emotions he enacts. As I was watching it, I was thinking of where we have relegated the role of rituals in present-day industrialized, individualized society. For all the progressive materialism and scientism, for all the benefits it has brought us in our health and our technology, We have also lost a lot at a base human level, and as a psychologist, I see those casualties firsthand. These films remind us not so much of the past or other worlds unbeknownst to us, but mirror our own present conditions in this 2-hour journey of a Norseman or a Jedi or a space cowboy, right? And with that, let's move to my number one pick, Ron Howard's 13 Lives.
Man's already died. We do nothing, we'll be bringing him out dead for sure.
So you are expecting casualties?
Yes, I expect casualties.
The great Ron Howard, Arrested Development, shout out to Arrested Development, and also who's Grinch with Jim Carrey, I just watched with my family in our annual holiday film marathon. Also with the great Colin Farrell, at least 3 of his films have been in my top 5 movies, which just shows the range of his performances this year. And also the great Viggo Mortensen, of course, known as most for Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and also the great Joel Edgerton, showcasing the 2018 Tuam Long cave rescue of 12 boys and their football or soccer coach. There's a great book called Humankind: A Hopeful History by the Dutch historian Rutger Bregman, which has a simple premise and a philosophical position. Humans are innately good. It starts with that hypothesis and uses historical, social, psychological, and spiritual data to cement that, particularly in the rise of nihilism and this all humans suck ideology, which as a psychologist who works primarily with young people is becoming more commonplace. Sebastian Junger's Tribe also has similar themes, showcasing that in seemingly chaotic, turbulent, and traumatic times such as war, famine, humans by and large do not fall into disarray and violence and nonsensical mob mentality. Most humans during these times strive to uplift each other and will even selflessly sacrifice their own health and well-being for strangers they've never met before. Such is the case in the Humankind: A Hopeful History. He speaks about the World War II London Blitz, which I expanded on much more fully in this video right here on resilience, because there was this social cohesiveness and this coming together, which helped build this fortitude, this defense against these psychological afflictions. 13 Lives is feel-good cinema and a case study belonging within the tapestry of collective human stories, such as In the Impossible, which deals with the Indonesian tsunami, or even a fictional film such as Sylvester Stallone's Daylight, which was trashed by critics when it came out, but was one of the earliest films I remember watching on the idea of sacrifice and altruism. In contrast to Daylight or even Sylvester Stallone's Cliffhanger, which usually showcases this one lone, courageous human who puts this level of responsibility on his own shoulders to save others, 13 Lives showcases the collective goodness and responsibility and adaptive decision-making needed from all parties at hand. At the end of the film, after this literal struggle for the lives of children and even their own lives, he sees that each element in its own way formed the social and cultural and psychological collectiveness needed to believe in the first place. And then beyond the social level, when we actually go into the cave rescuers cannot believe that the children have survived after 10 plus days with no food or water. We learned that the way they did this was through the coach, who helped his team, made up of mostly like 11, 12, 13-year-olds, practice long-form meditation to lower their physiological arousal and preserve precious physical, spiritual, psychological resources. And meditation is correlated with decreases in pain tolerance and parasympathetic activation, which you can read about more in this evidence-based article right here. I'm making a list on my website of great human cinema, films with no overt violence, no overt sexual activity, no heightened sensationalism, films that an entire family, an entire community, or even one person hungry for psychological and spiritual nourishment can consume. watch and learn and immerse themselves into to gain insight about the human condition. In this case, that human beings are good, and how, I mean, we need that in today's society. Just that idea itself can change the world. And I know that I'm going to start with this film first and foremost, 13 Lives, directed by the great Ron Howard. Thank you guys so much. As always, I put links in the description below, as well as links to my website and these previous videos that I made going more into previous films. I'm a huge film fan. There's a reason why in so many other videos that have nothing to do with films per se, I always integrate cinema, because art for me is a much more transcendent activation vehicle than the empirical sciences ever can be, right? It goes into a much deeper sacred place in our heart and helps elevate that psychological, spiritual condition and capability that we each have. With that, thank you all so much, and I will see you on the next episode. Thank you.